Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and as we sort of conclude our video here on epistemology, we're going to talk about a couple last categories or areas. And the first one is this issue of certainty. As we saw very early on, Microsoft and Carter says epistemology is concerned with the definition of knowledge, the criteria and sources of knowledge, as well as the degree to which each kind of knowledge is certain. And so certainty, and whether or not we should be certain and why we should be certain, what the basis of certainty is, part of the study of epistemology. Now, in the objective approach, this is going to be very comfortable with being certain, because the idea is your knowledge is based upon objectively true universal facts that are accessible to everyone through the senses like hearing and seeing and those types of things. So because it's based on fact, you can be very comfortable. But in the subjective approach, there's going to be sort of this emphasis on the external world is not really something that is going to affect your reality. Perception is reality, and external facts are not. And so one person's perception and one person's reality is going to differ from another's, and no one can know for sure. And so you shouldn't be asserting with certainty your point of view is absolutely correct in that sense. So here's an example in the following quote we're going to play. And now the author here that's in this quote is author Deepak Chopra. Time magazine named him as one of the most 100 influential people of the 20th century. He's written several books. In fact, he's a New York Times best-selling author. And the following clip is from Lee Strobel's program on PAX, Faith Under Fire, from 2006. And so I think we'll just stop for a second, play the clip, and we'll come back and talk about what Dr. Chopra has to say about uncertainty.
What's your definition of faith, Greg?
My definition of faith is a reasonable trust in something you have good reason to believe is true. I got in a limo this morning and drove over to this thing. I entrusted myself to that limo driver because I figured he was hired by you guys and he knew the route. So I put my trust in him when I climbed into the car and depended upon him to take me to this location to do this filming. That is a reasonable act of trust based on information. Now, I could have gone out and walked into the street and jumped into any car that was going by and hoped they would take me to the right destination. That would be a leap of faith. That's the distinction I'm talking about here.
Can we or can we not know the truth about God?
I think in a certain state of awareness, when we can experience deep stillness within us, we can get a great taste for it. But I don't think we can, in the relative, ever know the truth unless we are willing to embrace our own uncertainty and take that leap of faith and say, I'll trust the unknown. But you seem to be very sure that your point of view is correct,
no,
aren't you?
I'm pretty confident, but that's because I've looked carefully.
Good luck.
And that's because I've looked carefully.
So are the Islamists, so are the Hindus, so are the Jains, so are the Zoroastrians.
This is precisely why psychological confidence isn't enough. You need more than psychological confidence. You need good reasons to support that. And this is why a lot of work that I've done and Leah's done as well is to give reasons for faith. So we're not taking a jump, a leap of faith. It's not religious wishful thinking, but we are trying to build knowledge based on good rationale.
The difference between you and me is you're certain and I'm not. That's all. You know, and my uncertainty I'm willing to embrace, and I'm comfortable with my uncertainty, and you seem to know the truth. So that's our essential difference.
If you've got good reasons for it, you shouldn't be faulted for having confidence in your view.
Okay, so what did Dr. Chopra just say? Let's focus particularly on the phrase where he says, in the relative, I don't think we can ever know the truth unless we are willing to embrace our own uncertainty. We can't know the truth unless we embrace uncertainty and take that leap of faith and say, I'll trust the unknown. So faith in the unknown. It's a blind faith. This is a subjective and mystical faith. This is not the Moses gave signs and the people were supposed to believe on the basis of the signs, or Jesus gave all these miracles and people should listen to his words and conclude, hey, the words are reasonable, the miracles are proof from God, it's in line with what we see in the Old Testament, so let's conclude through reason and evidence that this is the truth. It's not that kind of faith. Dr. Chopra was talking about blind faith, the faith of mysticism. And so he's actually putting that in terms of our need to be uncertain about truth. We have to embrace uncertainty. And anyone who comes along dogmatically, in fact, the context of the clip is a disagreement between Greg Koukl, who's a Christian philosopher and apologist, versus Dr. Chopra, who's representing an alternative point of view, the mystical point of view, the subjective point of view. And Dr. Chopra's point here is that Christianity is too dogmatic. We have to embrace uncertainty. And so this is a battle. When you see, and particularly I want to focus this on Christians, when you see Christians who disagree with each other over doctrine, and one of them asserts that the other is being too dogmatic and arrogant because they're so certain, they're coming from a subjective, mystical worldview. That is not the worldview of Christianity. Worldview of Christianity will say you're wrong, and I can demonstrate that based upon objective facts and on reason, but it's not going to object to the person simply being certain or call that arrogant. That's the point of view of the mystical, subjective worldviews that are out there. So I just wanted to cover that so we could kind of understand those types of statements that we find sometimes in debates, even in discussions among Christians, contextually in terms of the worldview from which they come from. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the implications that these worldviews have for our daily point of view, our daily life. And I want to sort of bring up another chart here. And the title of this chart is Typical Default Solution to Most People. So we have two opposing ways to operate. For everyday matters and decisions, including things like business decisions, justice, politics, medicine, debate, those types of things, people will approach things objectively, scientifically. They'll look at objective evidence, facts, they'll apply reason to them. If it's an email that you receive or a letter or instructional manual, you'll approach it through hermeneutics. You'll take grammar, you'll take the author's intent and all those types of things into consideration to get the objective meaning out of the email or out of the instructional text. Certainty is not going to be something you have a problem with when it comes to everyday matters and decisions that you make. When it comes to moral and spiritual truth, though, people will have a whole separate category. And now for these things alone, moral and spiritual truth, they're going to approach things subjectively in terms of your perception is all that matters. And everybody's perception in reality is different. They're going to have a mystical view of knowledge, that you get your view of morals and spiritual truths through some sort of intuition. They're going to have meditative realization. They're going to have deconstruction when it comes to religious texts, saying that the texts don't have any inherent meaning that's objectively true for all of us. It's just based upon our own individual interpretations. They're going to have a blind faith, and they're going to have an extreme amount of uncertainty. And I would argue that dividing up the world into two different types of things like that, two different categories, is actually a form of psychosis. So I want to take a real quick break, and we'll come back and talk about some definitions on that point. Okay, so what do I mean by psychosis or by psychologically disturbed behavior? Let's read some definitions from Britannica that I think would be helpful for us. In their definition of psychosis, Britannica states, the inability to objectively evaluate reality. It says the psychotic's emotional and cognitive processes appear to the observant to be independent of what is happening in the surrounding environment. And finally, they state that the behavior can be so profound that they are often unable to function in everyday life, and that the psychotic patient is often unable to realize that his subjective perceptions and feelings do not correlate with objective reality. So psychosis, psychologically problematic behavior, is defined as in terms of the inability to objectively evaluate reality and also the inability to realize that your subjective perceptions don't correlate with reality. And so if your approach to spiritual truths and moral truths is to not objectively evaluate them, is to not understand that your subjective perceptions aren't really lining up necessarily with an objective reality that's outside your mind, then I believe that this is in fact operating with basically a psychotic form of spiritual and moral behavior. And I think this is in line with what we find in Scripture. Paul talks about the reprobate mind, giving men up to a depraved mind, that God did this because they did not retain their knowledge of God, and they changed the truth of God for a lie. So I think this is very much a scriptural statement, but I want to back it up with these definitions that we find today to contemporary society. And so in conclusion, I want to state that we shouldn't be approaching spiritual matters in a way that's different than the way we approach everyday life. We approach daily life. If you go to the doctor, you're going to want that doctor to be making decisions based on evidence and reason. If you go to a business situation, you want the same thing. And virtually every aspect of your life, from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to sleep at night, you make decisions based upon evidence, what you can see, what your experience is, and upon reason. And so I think we should be approaching spiritual truths the same way and moral truths the same way. And if we don't, effectively, we're operating with a form of moral and spiritual psychosis. And so I just want to conclude the video there. I want to encourage you, if you're Christians, to approach your doctrine as opposed, and also not only your doctrine, but evangelizing the world through an objective approach. Explain how Christianity is backed up by objective reason and facts. It's not a blind faith. And I hope that this has been helpful for you. We have more information online at BibleStudying.net, and I hope you'll come back again for the next video.